Tuesday morning, I pour my coffee, shuffle over, pull back the curtain, and freeze. My driveway is gone. Fresh concrete curbs poured overnight, bright, common area no access signs hammered in, and an HOA notice slapped on my garage door. Annexed per Section 12B of the amended CC&Rs. Violators towed at owner's expense. The mug shatters on the floor. My hands are shaking, not from shock, from rage. Pamela Voss and her board sent a crew at 3 a.m. like cowards, using 6 years of our HOA dues to do it. 6 years of stealing land, slapping fines, towing cars, and smirking. 6 years of betting that nobody in Cedarbrook knew enough to fight back. She didn't know I'm a senior real estate paralegal who eats HOA disputes for breakfast. 24 hours later, on my order, every car that board owned was gone. Not damaged, not blocked, just gone. Woke up to your driveway erased? What's your first move? Comment. Worst HOA state? Spill your horror story. Let me back up about 3 years, because this story doesn't start with a stolen driveway. It starts with a moving truck, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and the particular kind of optimism that only hits you when you've just signed the biggest check of your life. My name is Garrett Holloway. I'm 51 years old, semi-retired after 22 years working as a paralegal for a mid-size real estate firm in Columbus, Ohio. When my wife Denise and I sold our condo in 2021 and relocated to Cedarbrook Estates, a quiet residential community about 40 minutes outside Cincinnati, we thought we were buying peace, mature oak trees lining every street, a neighborhood pool that actually smelled like chlorine instead of whatever municipal mystery soup the public park used. Wide, well-lit driveways, good bones. We paid $387,000 for a corner lot on Whitmore Lane. Corner lot. That detail matters enormously, and I'll come back to it. The house had a side entry garage and a long driveway that ran parallel to the back edge of the property, cutting along the HOA's decorative green belt. When we moved in, our real estate agent, a decent enough guy named Skip Barlow, pointed at that green belt and said, almost as an afterthought, just FYI, the driveway easement is documented in your title. You're solid. We nodded, signed, and didn't think about it again. The smell of fresh paint and Denise's lavender candles filled every room. Biscuit claimed the backyard within 45 seconds. Life was good. The HOA at Cedarbrook Estates was run, at that time, by a woman named Pamela Voss. If you've ever met a Pamela Voss, and statistically, most of you watching this have met a Pamela Voss in some form, you know exactly what I mean when I say she carried herself like a county commissioner at a neighborhood cookout. Mid-60s, aggressively put together, the kind of person whose reading glasses hung on a beaded chain, and whose smile never quite reached her eyes. She'd been HOA board president for 6 consecutive terms, which, in Cedarbrook, meant she'd been re-elected every 2 years by a margin that, looking back, should have raised a lot more red flags. Pamela's first unfair act came about 4 months after we moved in. Our neighbor 2 houses down, a retired electrician named Dwight Okafor, had parked his work trailer, decommissioned, no longer in use, clearly just in storage, along the edge of his own property for about 2 weeks while he sorted out a storage unit. Pamela had it towed, on a Saturday morning, without a single warning notice. The fine was $400, the tow was $285, and when Dwight appealed to the board, Pamela ran the meeting herself, voted with her 2 appointed cronies, and dismissed the appeal in under 8 minutes. I attended that meeting, sat in the back of the Cedarbrook Community Center, beige carpet, flickering fluorescent bulbs, the faint ghost of someone's reheated lasagna in the air, and watched a man who'd worked 40 years in the trades get bulldozed by a woman who'd never once dirtied her hands. The room smelled like institutional cleaner and low-grade injustice. I introduced myself to Dwight in the parking lot afterward, gave him my background, helped him draft a formal objection letter, citing the HOA's own procedural bylaws, Section 7, which required a minimum 14-day written cure period before fines or enforcement. Pamela dismissed the letter, but Dwight kept it, and I kept a copy. That was the first move on the board. Nobody knew it yet, not even me really, but that night in the parking lot was the first piece of a structure I'd spend the next 2 years quietly assembling. Pamela Voss had been running Cedarbrook Estates like her personal fiefdom for so long, she'd forgotten one fundamental rule of petty power. Eventually, you pick on someone who keeps files. The first real shot across the bow came 14 months after we moved in. November, the kind of cold that gets in under your collar and reminds you winter in Ohio is not a metaphor. I'd hired a local landscaping crew to install a low stone retaining wall along the edge of our driveway. Nothing dramatic, about 18 inches tall, natural limestone, purely functional because the slope along the greenbelt was eroding and dumping silt onto our concrete every time it rained. I'd pulled the county permit. I'd reviewed the HOA's architectural guidelines. The wall was fully compliant. The contractor, a good man named Terrence Webb, who'd been doing this work in the area for 20 years, started on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Pamela Voss was standing at the edge of our property with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she had not slept well and intended to share that misery. "Mr. Holloway," she said, and the way she said it, flat, over-enunciated, made it sound less like a name and more like an accusation. "That wall is not approved." I told her I'd reviewed Section 4 of the architectural guidelines and that the wall met every dimensional and material specification listed. She flipped a page on her clipboard. The board issued an updated architectural addendum in August. Limestone is no longer an approved material in the Greenbelt adjacent zone. I asked to see the addendum. She said it had been mailed to all residents. I told her I'd never received it, which was true. I checked with 4 other neighbors that evening. None of them had received it either. 2 of them didn't even know an addendum existed. You could smell the setup from a mile away, like diesel smoke from Terrence's truck, still sitting in my driveway while we figured out what was happening. Here's the first legal trick the audience can actually use. HOA rule changes are only enforceable if the association can demonstrate proper notice was given to residents, typically defined in the governing documents themselves. Cedarbrook's CC and Rs required that any architectural guideline changes be sent by certified mail or published in the quarterly newsletter and posted on the community bulletin board for 30 days. I knew this because I'd read every page of those CC and Rs the weekend after we moved in. Sunday afternoon, Biscuit asleep at my feet, Denise watching something on Netflix, me with a highlighter and a yellow legal pad. We all have our hobbies. Pamela had not sent certified mail. The newsletter hadn't mentioned the addendum. The bulletin board had a flyer for a lost cat and a babysitting advertisement. I photographed all of it. I let Terrence finish the wall. When Pamela filed a formal violation notice 3 days later, $750 fine, mandatory removal of the wall within 30 days, I responded with a 12-page written objection that cited the exact CC&R provision, attached my photos, attached signed statements from 6 neighbors confirming no notice received, and requested a formal hearing before the full board. Pamela's response came back in 5 days. She was calling a special meeting. The fine stood. The wall had to come down. What she didn't expect was that I'd CC'd the Ohio Attorney General's HOA Enforcement Division, the county recorder's office, and a consumer protection attorney named Bridget Farwell, who'd been building a class action dossier on HOAs in the Cincinnati metro area for about 18 months. Bridget had been referred to me by a friend of a friend, and when I called her on a Wednesday night and described the situation, she was quiet for about 4 seconds and then said, "Tell me you kept the photos." I kept the photos. The special meeting was tense. The community center again, same beige carpet, same faint smell of burnt coffee this time. Pamela ran it like she always did, tight, fast, dismissive. But when I stood up and read the specific CC and R language aloud, and then distributed printed copies of my objection to every homeowner in the room, something shifted. The air changed. 3 homeowners I'd never spoken to before pulled me aside afterward. One of them, a 63-year-old retired math teacher named Clifton Marsh, told me Pamela had pulled the same notice trick on him 2 years earlier over a fence post. The board didn't drop the fine that night, but they tabled the wall removal. For Pamela, that was a concession so small she probably didn't notice it. For me, it was confirmation. She had a pattern, and patterns once documented become evidence. I went home, added Clifton Marsh's contact information to a spreadsheet I'd started calling the Ledger, and ordered a second yellow legal pad. The game was just beginning. Spring came to Cedarbrook, and with it, the HOA's annual budget meeting. traditionally the most boring event on the community calendar, usually attended by 8 to 12 homeowners and a plate of grocery store cookies nobody touches. This year, 26 residents showed up. Word had gotten around. Not because I'd been campaigning, I want to be clear about that. I hadn't knocked on doors or handed out pamphlets. I'd simply been visible. I'd shown up to board meetings. I'd helped Clifton with his fence post paperwork. I'd assisted a single mother named Priscilla Denton when Pamela tried to fine her $500 for her kid's basketball hoop being aesthetically non-compliant, a phrase that appears nowhere in the Cedarbrook CC and Rs, and which I made sure Priscilla knew. But the budget meeting was where things got interesting. Pamela presented the annual financials the way she always did. Projected onto a screen, read aloud in a voice designed to encourage no questions, moved quickly through. The HOA had collected approximately $184,000 in dues that year. Reserve fund, listed at $31,000. Operating expenses, $147,000. The math, loosely, appeared to work. I had been quietly corresponding with the county recorder's office and had obtained copies of the HOA's contractor invoices for the past 4 years through a public records request. HOA, financial records are public in Ohio. That's legal trick number 2, and it's one most homeowners don't know exists. In most states, HOA financial records, including contracts, invoices, and meeting minutes, are legally accessible to any member of the association. You can request them in writing, and they have to provide them. What I found in those invoices was interesting, very interesting. The landscaping contractor, a company called Green Path Solutions, had been paid $38,000 per year for the past 3 years. The previous contractor, whom I tracked down through an old board minute, had done the same scope of work for $21,000 annually. Green Path Solutions, I discovered after about 45 minutes of searching the Ohio Secretary of State's business registry, had been incorporated in 2019. One of its 2 registered principals shared a last name with Pamela Voss's daughter. I didn't say anything at the budget meeting. I sat in the back row. I ate one of the cookies, shortbread, slightly stale, the texture of chalk, and I listened, took notes, let Pamela control the room. On the drive home, I called Bridget Farwell. I think there's a self-dealing issue, I told her. Define think, she said. I think she's been routing association funds to a contractor with a familial connection for 3 years, with no competitive bid process. Bridget was quiet again. Then, I need those invoices. I emailed them that night. What happened next wasn't my doing, exactly. It was more like I'd lit a fuse that had already been sitting there for years, just waiting. Bridget's firm filed a preliminary inquiry with the Ohio Department of Commerce's Division of Real Estate, which oversees HOA governance in the state. The inquiry wasn't public. It wasn't loud. Pamela had no idea it existed. But here's where the villain made her first truly stupid move. 2 weeks after the budget meeting, I received a certified letter. The first certified letter I'd ever gotten from the Cedarbrook HOA, notifying me that my driveway had been reassessed under Section 12B of an amended CC and RS document, and that a portion of it, specifically the 28-foot stretch running along the Greenbelt easement, had been reincorporated as common area. I read the letter twice. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, very slowly, and read it a third time. The crunch of gravel under a car in the street outside sounded almost comically ordinary. They were claiming my driveway. Not all of it, just the part I used every single day to access my garage. The part without which my property, a corner lot, became functionally inaccessible from the street. And they'd amended the CC and Rs to do it. An amendment I hadn't voted on, hadn't been notified of, and couldn't find documented in any public record. My hands were steady when I picked up my phone. Steadier than I expected. 22 years of sitting across from people in disputes, of reading the emotional temperature of a negotiation. That training kicks in, eventually. You stop feeling and start calculating. I texted Bridget. They just made it a lot worse for themselves. She replied in under a minute. Tell me everything. The certified letter was dated a Friday. On Saturday morning, I drove to the county courthouse in my old Carhartt jacket and waited 40 minutes for the recorder's office to open. And then I stood at the counter and requested every recorded document related to Cedarbrook Estates filed in the last 18 months. The clerk, a heavy-set, methodical man named Doug, who moved at the precise speed of someone who has never once been in a hurry, printed out a stack of papers and slid them under the window without making eye contact. I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot, engine running for heat, and read every page. Here's what I found. The CC and RS amendment that claimed my driveway had been recorded with the county 3 weeks before it was sent to residents, which meant it had been filed quietly, without the required homeowner vote. Under Ohio law, and this is consistent across most states, amendments to HOA C, and RS require a supermajority vote of the membership, typically 67%, and must be properly noticed before recording. No vote had been held. No notice had gone out. Pamela had simply had the document drafted, signed it as board president along with her 2 board allies, and filed it. That is not how this works. That is not how any of this works. But here was the subtler problem. By filing it with the county recorder, she'd created a cloud on my title, which meant if I tried to refinance, sell, or even get a contractor to pull a permit on my property, that amendment would show up as an encumbrance. She'd essentially put a lien-adjacent instrument on my house without spending a single legal dollar on the proper process. It was efficient, in the way that a break-in is efficient. I called Bridget from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been expecting the call. When I explained what I'd found, she said, "Garrett, I need you to not do anything visible for the next 10 days. Define visible, I said. Don't confront her. Don't file anything on your own. Don't talk to the neighbors. Just send me the documents. I photographed every page and emailed them from the truck. Meanwhile, at home, Pamela's ground crew arrived on a Wednesday morning. I was watching from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, and began installing a new concrete curb where my driveway met the street. Not blocking my driveway, not yet, but establishing a physical marker, staking a claim. The smell of fresh concrete is distinctive, sharp, alkaline, a little like chalk dust. And for the rest of my life, I'm going to associate it with that particular flavor of audacity. I did not go outside. I photographed everything through the kitchen window. Wide shots, close shots, time-stamped on my phone. I got a clear shot of the truck, no magnetic company sign, which was interesting, and later traced the plates to a contractor named Voss Grading and Excavation LLC, registered to the husband of Pamela's niece. Another self-dealing connection. Add it to the ledger. The same week, 3 things happened in sequence that told me the pressure was building on her end. First, Priscilla Denton's new fine, the basketball hoop one, which I'd been helping her contest, was quietly dropped without explanation. Second, Clifton Marsh received a letter saying the board had reconsidered his fence post fine and was refunding his $400. Third, Pamela canceled the monthly open homeowner forum due to scheduling conflicts, something that had never happened in 6 years of her tenure. She was circling the wagons, pulling back from small fights to concentrate resources on the big one, which meant she knew the big one was coming. What Pamela didn't know, couldn't have known, because we'd been careful, was that Bridget Farwell's office had spent those 10 days doing 3 things simultaneously. Filing an emergency motion in the County Common Pleas Court to have the CC and RS amendment voided for procedural deficiency, reaching out to a local television news reporter named Sandra Chu, who covered consumer protection stories and had done a piece on HOA abuses the prior year, and, most importantly, quietly connecting with every homeowner I'd added to the ledger over 18 months. 14 households, 14 separate documented instances of improper fines, procedural violations, or financial irregularities. 14 people who, when asked if they'd be willing to submit signed affidavits, said yes. 12 of them said yes within 24 hours. I printed the affidavit stack at the public library. 41 pages, the warm paper smell of the printer, the satisfying weight of it in my hands, and drove it to Bridget's office on a Thursday afternoon. She flipped through it without reading it, judged the thickness, and set it on her desk. "Good," she said. "Now we build the trap." The trap started with a title search, a proper professional one, the kind my firm used to commission for commercial transactions, not the $30 online summary most homeowners rely on. Bridget's firm hired a title examiner named Ronald Spear, a meticulous semi-retired attorney who'd been doing this work for 31 years and who had the disposition of someone who genuinely loved finding problems in documents. Ronald called me on a Tuesday afternoon. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "I found something you're going to want to sit down for." I was already sitting. I sat down harder. Here was the thing Ronald had found. The original recorded plat for Cedarbrook Estates, filed in 1987 when the development was built, contained a specific easement notation on our corner lot. Specifically, it described a 30-foot owner's access strip running along the greenbelt boundary, designated in perpetuity for the exclusive use of the lot owner. Not an HOA easement, not a shared easement, an owner's exclusive easement, appurtenant to the property, which by definition runs with the land and cannot be extinguished by a subsequent CC and RS amendment. Cannot be extinguished. This is the legal concept of an appurtenant easement, and it's powerful. Once recorded on the original plat by a developer, it attaches to the land itself. A homeowners association cannot override it. A board vote cannot override it. Even a properly executed CC and Rs amendment, which this wasn't, cannot override a plat-level easement without going back to court and demonstrating the easement has been abandoned or is no longer necessary. And abandonment requires explicit, documented non-use over an extended period, not the case when I drive over it literally every day. Pamela's lawyers, whoever they were, had either not pulled the 1987 plat, or they had pulled it and counted on the fact that no homeowner would. Practical takeaway: always pull the original recorded plat for your property, not the HOA map, the county recorder's plat. Easements are recorded there, and they override almost everything that comes after. But Ronald wasn't done. The second thing he found was more personal and more explosive. In 2019, 2 years before we bought our house, the Cedarbrook HOA had received a $60,000 loan from a private lender to fund common area infrastructure improvements. The loan was documented in the recorder's office because it was secured against HOA common area property. The repayment schedule showed the loan should have been retired by 2022. The current balance? Still $47,000 outstanding. And the private lender on the loan? An LLC called Voss Capital Management, which, per the Ohio Secretary of State's registry, was registered to Pamela Voss herself. She had lent her own HOA money at a 9.4% interest rate, nearly double the prevailing rate at the time, and was collecting annual interest payments from the association fund she personally controlled. Payments that came out of the $184,000 in annual dues that every homeowner in Cedarbrook paid, including me. Including Dwight Okafor, whose trailer got towed on a Saturday morning, including Priscilla Denton, whose kids couldn't put a basketball hoop in their own driveway. I stared at the documents for a long time. Outside, a cardinal was making noise in the oak tree by the window. The ordinary world doing its ordinary thing, completely indifferent to the extraordinary moment happening inside my kitchen. This wasn't just petty power anymore. This was fraud. The next 3 weeks were the quietest and most deliberate of the entire story. No confrontations, no letters, no board meetings. On the surface, Garrett Holloway was just a neighbor walking his dog, waving at the mail carrier, living a quiet, retired life in Cedarbrook Estates. Under the surface, it was a different situation entirely. Bridget Farwell's office was running on 3 parallel tracks. The first was the civil case. The emergency motion to void the CC and RS amendment had been accepted by the County Common Pleas Court, and a hearing date had been set for 6 weeks out. The motion cited the procedural deficiency, no homeowner vote, improper notice, as well as the 1987 plat easement, which Ronald Spear had provided an expert affidavit on. The case was, in Bridget's words, about as bulletproof as civil motions get. She said this in the flat tone of a lawyer who has learned not to celebrate until it's over. But even she couldn't entirely suppress the small note of satisfaction. The second track was the financial fraud referral. Bridget had referred the Voss Capital Management loan documentation to the Ohio Division of Real Estate and the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit simultaneously. She'd also forwarded it to Sandra Chu at Channel 7. Sandra was the kind of reporter who had that specific quality you want in a journalist when you're the good guy. She was patient, she was thorough, and she did not go to air until she had it cold. The third track was the one I was personally running, and it was the most satisfying to build. Here's the thing about a corner lot with a side entry garage. The driveway that runs along the greenbelt is not just convenient. It is the only vehicular access to my garage. Without it, my garage door opens onto a 10-inch strip of landscaping and a decorative boulder. The driveway wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. And because it was a necessity, because it was structurally integrated into the property's access plan since 1987, the HOA's claim that they could absorb it into common area was, at its core, a taking of property without compensation. In real estate law, there's a concept called inverse condemnation. When a government entity, or, in some jurisdictions, a common interest community effectively deprives you of property use without going through proper condemnation proceedings and paying fair market compensation. It's a technical area, but the core principle is simple. You cannot take my property's utility away without either proper legal authority or fair compensation. Pamela had neither. I filed a separate inverse condemnation claim, small, surgical, designed not to win immediately, but to attach to my property record and complicate any further HOA action. Bridget reviewed the filing. "This makes their title position messy," she said. "They'd have to resolve it before they could record anything else against your property." That was exactly the point. Now for the physical part. Because the HOA's contractors had installed that concrete curb marker on what was technically my easement area, and because that curb was now redirecting surface water from the greenbelt directly across my driveway toward my garage, causing an actual drainage issue I documented with photographs and a brief report from a licensed engineer named Frank Osei, who charged me $350 and described the drainage situation in a letter, using the specific phrase, "material risk of foundation damage." I had grounds to take action on the curb itself. I hired Terrence Webb, the same contractor from the limestone wall, to install a low-profile concrete drainage channel across the front of my property, running perpendicular to the curb. Fully permitted. Fully within the property lines as established by the 1987 plat. Functionally, it diverted the water problem. But it also, and this was the part that mattered, rendered the HOA's decorative curb installation structurally isolated on a small spit of concrete that now had no drainage connection to the street. And I applied for a specific county permit that, once granted, legally classified my driveway approach as a private vehicular access way, which under county ordinance triggered certain protections against obstruction by third parties, including HOAs, including anyone who might decide to, say, park a vehicle in my driveway approach claiming common area rights. Obstruction of a permitted private vehicular access way is subject to immediate tow on owner's order. No further notice required. I got the permit, framed a copy, put it on my desk, because sometimes you have to enjoy the small moments. Clifton Marsh was coordinating the homeowners. 14 households had signed affidavits. 2 of them, including Dwight Okafor, were willing to go on camera with Sandra Chu. Priscilla Denton had been documenting her own experience for months and had a folder that impressed even Bridget. The pieces were aligned. The permits were filed. The court hearing was 6 weeks out. We just had to wait for Pamela to make one more move. She did not disappoint. With 4 weeks to go before the court hearing, Pamela Voss went on offense. The first signal was a letter sent to every homeowner in Cedarbrook, all 89 households, on HOA letterhead, with Pamela's signature at the bottom and the board's official seal embossed in the corner. The letter described an ongoing legal challenge by one homeowner, unnamed but everyone knew, that was threatening the financial stability of the association and the property values of all residents. It characterized the court filing as frivolous and motivated by personal grievances rather than community benefit. It asked homeowners to support the board in defending Cedarbrook's standards and security. I read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning. Then I read it again, slower. Then I called Bridget. "She just sent the neighborhood a statement," I said. "I know. 3 people forwarded it to me before 8 a.m. Is it defamatory?" Bridget paused. "Possibly. Depends on how you want to play it. My advice? Let her dig." The second move was more personal. Pamela had apparently been making calls, not official ones, but the soft kind, the kind that happen at the neighborhood pool and over back fences. What she was telling people, based on what came back to me through Clifton, was that Garrett Holloway was difficult, that he'd had issues at his previous residence, and that the stone wall dispute had been the result of him refusing to cooperate with reasonable community standards. She didn't say anything specific enough to be actionable, just enough to create the ambient social fog that isolated people from potential allies. It was a tactic, a recognizable one, and it had almost certainly worked on other people before me. What she didn't account for was that Clifton Marsh was 70 years old, had lived in Cedarbrook for 11 years, and was deeply, constitutionally trusted by his neighbors. When he started quietly countering the narrative, not with a campaign, just with the patient credibility of a man who'd been there long enough to remember everything, the fog started to clear. The third move was the one that surprised me, and not pleasantly. A city inspector showed up at my house on a Monday afternoon. Polite, professional, a young woman named Officer Reyes, not a police officer, a municipal code compliance officer, with a clipboard and a notice. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that my drainage channel installation was improperly permitted and constituted an unauthorized modification of the public right-of-way. I pulled out my permit documentation immediately, right there on the porch. Officer Reyes examined it, made some notes, and said, "Looks like your paperwork's in order. Whoever filed this may not have known about the permit." She was professional about it, but she also let slip, probably shouldn't have, but I appreciated it, that the complaint had been filed by an HOA board officer. I photographed the complaint notice before giving it back, because of course I did. Filing a false or frivolous complaint with a government agency, knowing the underlying permit is valid, can constitute misuse of government process. In some jurisdictions, it triggers civil liability. I added it to the file and notified Bridget. The fourth move was financial. Pamela's board sent me a formal invoice for $3,200. Itemized as legal fees incurred by the association in defending against homeowner litigation, claiming that the HOA's governing documents allowed recovery of legal defense costs from homeowners who initiated suits against the board. Bridget laughed. Actual, genuine laughter, which I'd never heard from her before. "That provision only applies to suits the homeowner loses," she said, "and they haven't won anything. Forward it to me." She responded to the board's attorney with a letter, 4 paragraphs, precise as a scalpel, pointing out the invoicing was legally premature, potentially constituted an attempt to discourage active litigation, and that any further such communications would be incorporated into a separate claim for association harassment. The invoice was withdrawn 4 days later. No explanation. All of these moves, the letter to neighbors, the social whispering campaign, the false code complaint, the premature legal fee invoice, told me one thing with absolute clarity. Pamela Voss was scared. Scared people make mistakes. Scared people in power make loud mistakes. I kept my head down, kept my file organized, and watched the calendar. 3 weeks to the hearing. 2 weeks. 1 week. Biscuit had developed a habit of sitting in the front window in the evenings, watching the street like a furry surveillance camera. I'm convinced he could feel the tension. Dogs know things. The night before the hearing, I made a pot of coffee, laid out every document in chronological order, and slept better than I had in months. The hearing was a Thursday. I wore a suit, charcoal gray, one I hadn't worn since leaving the firm, slightly tight in the shoulders. Denise straightened my tie in the kitchen and said, "Don't get cocky." She knows me. Bridget met me on the courthouse steps. She was carrying 2 litigation bags and a coffee, which she hadn't touched. That's how I knew she was focused. Pamela's side had hired a law firm out of Cincinnati, Kendall, Barr & Associates, 3 attorneys listed on the filing. I recognized the firm name from my paralegal days. Large retainer, hourly billing. Expensive for a homeowners association that was already carrying $47,000 in fraudulently structured debt. The hearing was a preliminary motion, not the trial, not yet. But it was pivotal because the judge would rule on whether the CC and RS amendment was procedurally valid, and, if not, whether it should be voided pending full litigation. We also had a temporary restraining order motion before the court to prevent any further construction or modification of the driveway area while the case proceeded. Bridget argued first, and she was terrific, crisp and methodical, walking the judge through the CC and RS language, the supermajority requirement, the lack of recorded homeowner vote, the 1987 plat easement. She introduced Ronald Spears' affidavit. She introduced the surveyor's documentation. She introduced the chain of title going back to the original developer. Kendall, Barr's lead attorney, a polished man in his mid-50s named Whitfield, responded with an argument I had anticipated but still found audacious, that the amendment was validly executed by the board under an emergency action provision in the HOA's governing documents that allowed the board to act without a full membership vote in cases of immediate threat to common area integrity. The emergency provision, I'd read it, Section 9, D. It was designed for things like storm damage, flooding, structural hazards. It was not designed for boundary realignment on a homeowner's private driveway easement. The judge, a composed woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Carolyn Dupree, asked Whitfield to specify what emergency justified the action. He pivoted to a general description of ongoing maintenance concerns in the Greenbelt area, which was vague enough to be meaningless. Judge Dupree noted it on her pad, with the expression of a person writing the word weak, without actually writing the word weak. Bridget responded that the emergency provision, per its own language, required a documented board resolution citing the specific emergency condition, filed contemporaneously with the action. No such resolution had been recorded, at all. She placed the certified absence of record certificate from the county on the exhibit table with the quiet satisfaction of someone setting down a winning card. Judge Dupree granted the temporary restraining order. All construction and modification of the driveway area was frozen pending full hearing. The CC and RS amendment was placed under review with a formal hearing scheduled in 60 days. We won the morning. But here's the part that set the real trap in motion. And it happened that same afternoon, and it was entirely Pamela's doing. Emboldened, or panicked, by the morning's outcome, Pamela convened what she called an emergency board session in the community center that very afternoon, without notice to homeowners, and directed the HOA's maintenance contractor to park 2 vehicles, an HOA-branded pickup truck and a utility trailer, across the entirety of my driveway approach, not parking near it, across it, blocking vehicular access to my property. I received a photo from Clifton Marsh at 3:47 p.m. I was still in my suit. Here is the thing about a county-permitted private vehicular access way with an appurtenant plat easement and a live restraining order from the County Common Pleas Court. When a third party physically obstructs it, you don't have to go back to court. You don't have to file a motion. You don't have to wait. You call the non-emergency county sheriff's line. You provide the permit number, the property address, and the case number for the active restraining order. You explain that vehicles are blocking a permitted private access way in apparent violation of the court order. And then you wait about 45 minutes. I changed out of my suit, made a sandwich, let Biscuit out into the yard. The late afternoon light was coming through the kitchen windows at a low angle, golden orange, the kind of light that makes everything look like the establishing shot of something important. My phone rang. It was Clifton. "Garrett," he said, and I could hear the grin in it. "The tow truck just pulled up." I walked to the front of the house and looked out the window. 2 vehicles, HOA plates, being loaded onto a flatbed. I watched the whole thing from my porch, coffee in hand. The tow was the trigger. What happened in the 60 days that followed was the avalanche. Sandra Chu's segment aired 11 days after the tow. Channel 7, 6 o'clock news, 7 minutes and 40 seconds, an eternity in local news time, which told you everything about how solid the story was. The title card read, HOA President Faces Fraud Allegations as Homeowners Fight Back. Dwight Okafor sat across from Sandra in his living room in a clean flannel shirt and explained, in the measured voice of a man who has spent 40 years measuring twice and cutting once, exactly what had happened with his trailer and his $685 in total losses. Priscilla Denton described the basketball hoop incident and started crying briefly, collected herself and said, "I just want my kids to be able to play in their own driveway." That was the moment that cut through, I think, that sentence. I was interviewed in the segment for about 40 seconds. Bridget had coached me carefully on what to say and what not to say, and I simply stated the factual record. The title search findings, the Voss Capital Management loan, the lack of proper process. I was dry about it, deliberately. The facts were dramatic enough without me performing anything. The segment ran on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, the Cedarbrook Estates HOA Facebook group, which had been a placid stream of lost pet notices and pool schedule updates, had absorbed approximately 340 comments. By Thursday, a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer had picked it up. By Friday, the story was being shared on 3 national HOA grievance Facebook groups with a combined membership of over 400,000 people. The formal public showdown happened 2 weeks later. The County Common Pleas Court scheduled full hearing on the CC&R's amendment, which had by then accumulated additional filings, including the Attorney General's preliminary fraud inquiry and a formal complaint from the Ohio Division of Real Estate regarding the Voss Capital Management loan. The community center the night before was packed, 61 homeowners, standing room only, the smell of bodies and coffee and the specific anxiety of people who have been holding something in for a long time and can finally see the exit. Pamela Voss arrived at the courthouse in a beige blazer and the expression of someone who has received bad legal advice and is pretending otherwise. Whitfield from Kendall, Barr, was beside her, but quieter than he'd been at the preliminary hearing. 2 of Pamela's 3 board allies had already resigned. One sent a written apology to the community that stopped just short of throwing Pamela under a bus and just kept driving. Judge Dupree ran the hearing with the efficiency of someone who has read every document and doesn't need to pretend otherwise. She voided the CC&Rs amendment completely, on 2 independent grounds: procedural deficiency and incompatibility with the recorded plat easement. She issued a permanent injunction against any further HOA action regarding my driveway or the Greenbelt easement strip. She ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees under Ohio's fee-shifting statute for frivolous HOA actions, approximately $18,400. Then she did something I hadn't entirely anticipated. She referred the Voss Capital Management loan documentation to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential fraud and breach of fiduciary duty charges. That referral was not announced in advance. Bridget had known it was possible, but hadn't wanted to overpromise. When the judge read it into the record, the courtroom was quiet for about 3 full seconds, the particular silence of a room absorbing information. And then it erupted in the low-grade noise of 60-something people reacting all at once. I sat absolutely still. Pamela stood up, too quickly, and her chair scraped loud on the floor. Whitfield put a hand on her arm. She sat back down. The mic drop moment, though, wasn't the judge's referral. It was what happened outside, on the courthouse steps, 15 minutes after the hearing ended. Sandra Chu was there with a camera. She'd been tipped off, not by me, and she caught Pamela walking out. Asked her a single question. "Ms. Voss, do you have any comment on the court's findings today?" Pamela looked at the camera for a long moment. Then she looked at the small crowd of Cedarbrook homeowners standing behind the camera. At Dwight, at Priscilla, at Clifton with his arms folded and his calm, patient face. She said nothing. She walked to her car, a new model SUV, white, and drove away. The steps were quiet for a second. Then Dwight Okafor, who is not a man given to public display, started to clap, slowly at first, then Clifton, then Priscilla, then the rest of them. I stood there on those courthouse steps in the late morning sun, and, I won't pretend otherwise, I had to look down at my shoes for a second, because some endings are too clean and real to look at directly. Here's what the ledger looked like when it was all closed out. The CC&Rs amendment, voided, permanently. My driveway, legally unimpeachable, with a recorded court order to back the 1987 plat easement. The HOA's legal fee obligation to me, paid in full, $18,400, drawn from the HOA reserve fund. Pamela Voss, resigned from the board within 30 days of the hearing. The 2 remaining board allies also resigned. The Voss Capital Management loan situation moved more slowly, as financial fraud matters tend to do. But it moved. The county prosecutor's review, combined with the AG inquiry and the Division of Real Estate complaint, resulted in a formal civil enforcement action filed 6 months after the hearing. I won't go into every detail because the case is still working through the civil process, but the bottom line is this. The HOA negotiated a settlement under which the Voss Capital Management loan was declared void. The interest already paid to Voss Capital was treated as an offset against future HOA obligations, and Pamela Voss agreed, as part of the settlement, to a 10-year bar from serving as an officer or director of any Ohio Homeowners Association. 10 years. I'll take it. The new HOA board is a genuinely different animal. Clifton Marsh ran for president and won with 78% of homeowner votes, the highest participation in a Cedarbrook board election in its history. Priscilla Denton joined the board as treasurer, which she has approached with the focused energy of someone who spent a year documenting the consequences of financial carelessness. Dwight Okafor declined a board seat, but agreed to chair a newly formed homeowner advisory committee, which meets monthly and requires the board to take public questions before any vote on fines or enforcement. The old landscaping contract with Green Path Solutions, the Voss family connected one, was put out to competitive bid. The new contract came in at $23,500 annually, $17,000 a year back in the reserve fund. That reserve fund is now at $58,000 and growing. I want to be honest about something. Winning this didn't make me feel the way I thought it would. I expected triumph to feel bigger. It mostly felt like relief. Relief and a kind of quiet satisfaction, the sensation of a problem correctly solved, like finding the last piece of a puzzle you've been working on for months and hearing it click into place. Denise said it better than I could. She said, "You didn't do this for us. You did it for Dwight." She's right, probably. The most meaningful part of the resolution, though, came from an unexpected direction. One of the homeowners who'd come forward with an affidavit, a woman named Hazel Trent, retired school teacher, 30 years in Cedarbrook, approached Clifton and me about 3 months after the hearing with an idea. She proposed that a portion of the recouped funds, specifically the $17,000 annual savings from the rebid landscaping contract, be channeled into a community scholarship fund for graduating seniors from the local high school who were pursuing trades or technical certification programs, electricians, HVAC technicians, plumbers, the skilled trades that people like Dwight Okafor had built careers in. The board approved it unanimously at their first meeting. The Cedarbrook Estates Skilled Trades Scholarship. First disbursement, two $2,500 awards in the spring to 2 students. At the small ceremony in the community center, better coffee this time, Priscilla had insisted, Dwight presented the first check. I watched him shake a 17-year-old's hand and say something quietly that made the kid stand up a little straighter. I didn't hear what he said. I didn't need to.
That certified letter is what gets me. Pamela didn't knock on Garrett's door, didn't call, didn't even wait for daylight. She stand up crew at 3 a.m., pour fresh concrete over his driveway, and mailed him a letter telling him his was the problem. 6 years of that, 6 years of people getting that letter and deciding the fight wasn't worth it. What she never counted on was someone reading the other documents. The ones from 1987, the original record blast that had his easement locked in before she ever sat in that board chair. The rules she used to take his driveway. Those same rules are what put her cars on a flatbed. That's the part I think about. Not the tow trucks, not the courtroom. Just the man sitting in his kitchen table on a Tuesday night, going through county records, finding the page she'd assumed nobody would ever find. Have you ever actually proved your property original records flat? Not the HOA map, the county recorder blast, because if your association had ever made a move that felt wrong, that document is where I start. Drop your situation in the comments. I read them. And if this story felt familiar, share it. Someone in your circle is probably dealing with their own version of this right now. Subscribe if you want to stay with us. There are more of this coming.